Samuel Brown was a short, unassuming man who walked with a pronounced limp. He had been born with a crippled foot, a physical defect that shaped his gait and defined his daily mobility. Because of his foot, Samuel learned the shoemaker's trade. He spent his life hunched over wooden lasts and workbenches, meticulously crafting his own custom footwear to accommodate the deformity. It was a tactile, grueling profession that required immense patience and physical stamina. In the early 1830s, Samuel joined the newly formed Mormon Church. In that social climate, this religious conversion immediately made him a target for political and local violence, turning a quiet artisan into a man under constant threat. Within a year, Samuel volunteered for an expedition known as Zion's Camp. He marched 800 miles on his crippled foot from Ohio to Missouri, carrying food and clothing to members of his faith who had already been dispossessed of their lands. This massive march across the frontier was only the beginning. It initiated a 20-year cycle of forced, violent displacement that would test the limits of his physical endurance. By 1838, the tension in Missouri erupted into a brawl at an election in Gallatin. When a mob attacked to prevent him from voting, Samuel was forced to defend his constitutional rights with nothing but his umbrella, parrying heavy wooden clubs in a chaotic scramble for the polls. The ensuing political violence led to the total expulsion of the Mormons from the state. Samuel and thousands of others were forced to flee into Illinois, where they spent years draining a swamp to build the city of Nauvoo. The peace in Nauvoo ended in 1844 with the assassination of their leader, Joseph Smith. When the news reached Samuel, he ripped his hat from his head and stomped on it, accidentally crushing a small red stone Smith had given him as a memento of their friendship. Local mobs issued a 24-hour eviction notice immediately after. Samuel placed his wife Lydia and their newborn son into a wagon and crossed the Mississippi River at night. As they reached the far bank, they turned and looked back to see their home engulfed in flames. With their legal rights ignored and their property destroyed, the family was left with no choice but to seek safety in the geographic unknown. In 1852, Samuel began the trek to the Salt Lake Valley. Moving into Nebraska territory, the threat shifted to the open trail. Along the North Platte River, a fast-moving cholera outbreak struck the camp, claiming victims within minutes of the first symptoms. One of the victims was Samuel's wife, Lydia. He buried her in a lonely, unmarked grave in the Nebraska wilderness, wrapped in a sheet and dressed in her best clothes. Standing by the grave, Samuel told his young daughter Emily that she would now have to be the mother to her 4 brothers. Then he continued the walk to Utah on his crippled foot. The sheer distance and isolation of the American West demanded a physical and emotional toll that few were prepared to pay, stripping the pioneers of almost everything they owned. Reaching the Salt Lake Valley brought no immediate relief. Samuel was sent south to the remote outpost of Fillmore, where the struggle for survival began again. The settlers lived in a fort, grinding wheat by hand at night, pooling property to avoid mass starvation. Simultaneously, they faced the sudden outbreak of the Black Hawk Indian War. During the conflict, Samuel's son was killed in a tragic misunderstanding. He was wearing a traded U.S. Army overcoat, and Native American scouts mistook him for a hostile soldier, ambushing him near the settlement. This escalating violence and the constant threat of famine tested the absolute limits of the community's resilience. In his old age, Samuel eventually settled in Payson, Utah. He had lost his homes, his wife, and multiple children to the trail and the violence of the frontier. Despite these losses, Samuel remained cheerful. He spent his final years in a small shoe shop, making footwear and handing out leather scraps to neighborhood children who came to visit him. His refusal to become bitter or broken by these decades of trauma suggests a profound psychological endurance that was as necessary as physical strength. The West was built by thousands of ordinary, unassuming people like Samuel, whose defining trait was a quiet, unbreakable capacity to endure.